When Clint Eastwood walked into one of the country's most prestigious film schools, no one expected the appearance of the Hollywood legend, least of all Professor Daniel Caldwell. A self-proclaimed expert in modern cinema, Caldwell was confident in his theories. To him, Clint was nothing more than an obsolete relic, a symbol of outdated masculinity that Hollywood had left behind. So, in front of his students, Caldwell tried to belittle him, mocking his films, his legacy, and his storytelling style. What he didn't know was that Clint hadn't come to debate. He had come to teach a lesson, and by the end of the class, the one humiliated would be Caldwell. The air inside classroom 214 of Prestige Film Academy was thick with self-assurance. The modern, sleek room, adorned with posters of critically acclaimed indie directors, perfectly reflected the mindset of its professor, Daniel Caldwell. A PhD in film studies and a self-proclaimed guardian of true cinema, Caldwell stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed, with a smug smile. His bright-eyed students, eager to impress, hung on his every word, notebooks open and laptop screens glowing. Today's class was one he had been waiting to teach all semester. The end of traditional masculinity, how Clint Eastwood represents a bygone era. Caldwell clicked his remote, and the projector hummed, casting an image onto the screen. Clint Eastwood, cigar clenched between his teeth, with his iconic glare from the good, the bad, and the ugly. "This," Caldwell declared, pointing at the image, "is a relic, a symbol of a time when masculinity was one-dimensional, grunts, violence, and outdated notions of heroism." He chuckled as he paced the room. "Tell me, class, how often do we see this type of protagonist in today's best films?" Some students laughed, others nodded. Cinema has evolved. We've moved beyond the strong, silent type. He clicked the remote again, replacing Eastwood's image with a still from an art house film, a melancholic man staring at the rain. "This," Caldwell continued, "is a film about vulnerability, self-exploration. No guns, no revenge, no obsolete power fantasies. This is what storytelling should be." A student in the back whispered to a friend, "Didn't Clint Eastwood win Best Director multiple times?" Caldwell pretended not to hear. Instead, he launched his true attack. "Eastwood's films," he continued with disdain, "are predictable, formulaic, harmful. They reinforce toxic masculinity, the idea that problems are solved with a gun and a glare, that emotions are weakness." Laughter rippled through the classroom. The professor fed off their approval. "This type of narrative," Caldwell leaned forward, eyes gleaming, "is dead. Hollywood has moved on." Another click, and the screen went dark. The students applauded, and Caldwell smiled, satisfied with himself. What he didn't know was that his lecture was about to be rewritten. A hand rose in the middle of the room. It was Daniel Fisher, a second-year student with a deep love for westerns and war films. He wasn't one to challenge Caldwell, no one was, but something about the professor's speech didn't sit right with him. "Professor," Daniel asked cautiously, "isn't Clint Eastwood one of the most successful directors of all time? I mean, Unforgiven won Best Picture. $1 Million Baby, too. And Gran Torino." Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. "Ah, yes," he sighed, as if the question exhausted him. "He's had success, but let's be honest. His influence is fading. His audience is aging. The industry no longer aligns with his worldview." Some students nodded in agreement. Caldwell smiled, pleased with himself. And then the classroom door creaked open. At first, no one reacted. They assumed it was another student arriving late, maybe even the dean making a surprise visit. But when the figure stepped into the light, the entire room froze. There, standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets and gaze as steely as a gunslinger, was Clint Eastwood. Silence fell. Some students gasped. One nearly dropped his laptop. Caldwell's smug confidence evaporated in real time. Clint stepped forward, his boots echoing against the polished floor. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, scanning the room with the same unreadable expression that had made grown men rethink their life choices for decades. The students glanced between their professor and Clint, feeling the weight of the moment. Caldwell swallowed hard. The man he'd just spent 20 minutes disparaging was standing in his classroom, staring him down. The air had changed, and Caldwell was about to learn a lesson no film school had ever taught him. What happens when you underestimate Clint Eastwood? The silence stretched, every second amplifying the tension. Students shifted in their seats, phones subtly raised to record the moment. No one wanted to miss what was about to unfold. Finally, Clint took another step forward. It was deliberate, measured. The kind of movement that spoke volumes without a word. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Caldwell, who was now gripping the edge of the podium as if it might anchor him against the tide of embarrassment rising in his chest. "Professor Caldwell," Clint said, his voice gravelly yet calm, "seems like you've got a lot to say about me." Caldwell forced a chuckle, trying to mask his discomfort. "Mr. Eastwood, I was merely illustrating how cinema has progressed beyond outdated tropes. It's nothing personal." Clint's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, not one of amusement, but of recognition. He'd seen this type before, men who spoke with certainty about worlds they'd never truly stepped into. "Nothing personal, huh?" Clint drawled. "Funny how it always sounds personal when someone's trying to make a name for themselves." The class murmured. A few students exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Caldwell cleared his throat, straightening his tie. "Well," Caldwell said, attempting to regain control, "we're here to discuss film as an art form, not personalities. My critique is about the evolution of storytelling, how audiences now seek complex, nuanced narratives rather than simplistic tales of rugged individualism." Clint nodded slowly, stepping closer until he stood just a few feet from Caldwell. "Nuanced, huh?" Clint mused. "Tell me, Professor, how many movies have you made?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Caldwell blinked, caught off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "Simple question," Clint said, voice steady. "How many films have you directed? Produced? Written?" Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Well, I've studied cinema extensively. I've written numerous papers and conducted—" "That's not what I asked," Clint interrupted, eyes never leaving Caldwell's. "How many times have you stood on a set, made a decision that cost thousands of dollars a minute, watched the sun set too early while your shot list was half done? How many times have you told an actor cut and known deep down you didn't get the shot, but the budget said you had to move on?" The room was silent. Caldwell's face reddened. "I don't have to be a director to understand storytelling," Caldwell snapped, his frustration breaking through the polished veneer. Clint's smile widened, just a hair. "That's what I thought." He turned to the class, hands still in his pockets. "See, folks, it's easy to talk about movies from a cushy chair. Easy to break down what's wrong with a story when you've never had to tell one yourself." Daniel Fisher, the student who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward, captivated. Others followed suit, phones forgotten, attention fully captured by the living legend standing before them. "Movies aren't about theories," Clint continued. "They're about people. Flawed, stubborn, hopeful people. You don't connect with an audience by showing them how smart you are. You connect by making them feel something real." He paused, letting the words settle. "And you sure as hell don't do it by tearing down the ones who paved the road you're walking on." Caldwell's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Clint glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of each student. "Any of you want to make movies? Real movies, not essays with cinematography? Then get out there and fail a few times. Shoot scenes that don't work. Edit footage you hate. Learn by doing, not by parroting someone else's opinion." With that, Clint tipped his head, turned on his heel, and walked out, boots thudding against the polished floor. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Caldwell standing alone. the weight of his own words now a chain around his neck. And for the first time all semester, Caldwell had nothing left to say. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Caldwell's once confident smile had vanished, replaced by an expression far less assured, far less in control. Meanwhile, the students murmured among themselves, some nudging each other, others pulling out their phones. A few were already recording. They knew something legendary was about to happen. The dean stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with reverence, "it is an honor to introduce today's guest, a man whose influence on cinema spans decades, who has not only redefined storytelling, but continues to do so, Mr. Clint Eastwood." A murmur of applause swept through the room, some hesitant, others filled with genuine admiration. Clint gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable as he strode to the front of the class. His mere presence shifted the atmosphere. Where Caldwell had spoken with smug superiority, Clint didn't need to say a word to command attention. But there was one person who wasn't clapping: Caldwell. He forced a smile, his hands gripping the podium a little tighter. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, voice strained, "I was just discussing your, peculiar approach to filmmaking." Clint raised an eyebrow and leaned back slightly in his chair, utterly relaxed. "That's so," he replied, his voice firm and deliberate. "I'm listening." Caldwell hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then cleared his throat, regaining composure. "Well," he began, pacing as he organized his thoughts, "I was explaining to my students how cinema has evolved, how modern filmmaking has transcended old cliches, rugged individualism, violence as a solution, outdated notions of masculinity." He gestured toward Clint with a rehearsed smile. "You represent an era that, while influential, has, well, let's just say the modern audience expects something deeper." The students exchanged glances, some nodding with Caldwell, but others no longer so sure. Clint tilted his head, letting the words settle. Then, finally, he spoke. "That what you think?" Just 4 words. Yet somehow the air grew heavier. Caldwell shifted, expecting Clint to get defensive, to feel uncomfortable, perhaps even aggressive. Instead, he was just waiting, watching, letting Caldwell dig his own grave. Caldwell took a deep breath, straightening his posture. He couldn't afford to lose control, not in front of his students. This was still his classroom, his territory. So he did what he always did. He talked. "I think we can all recognize your achievements," Caldwell began, his tone carefully balanced between condescension and forced politeness. "You've had, without a doubt, a long and historically significant career." Clint didn't flinch, not a blink. Caldwell continued, gaining momentum. "But as I was telling my students earlier," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "your films, while culturally significant, are undeniably outdated." He turned to the class, building his argument like a prosecutor before a jury. "They glorify violence, reinforce harmful stereotypes, and present a world where problems are solved with a gun instead of dialogue, with brute force instead of nuance." Some students nodded, some out of conviction, others simply following the professor's lead. Caldwell stepped forward, emboldened. "And let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood," he said, regaining his arrogant smile. "You represent an era that has long passed. Cinema has evolved beyond your simplistic black and white narratives." A few snaps of approval came from the progressive students in the back. Caldwell smiled. He thought he was winning. But Clint? Clint was just waiting his turn. The legendary filmmaker remained seated, relaxed, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. Then, slowly, so slowly that everyone leaned forward, he inhaled, exhaled, and finally spoke. "Professor," Clint said, voice calm and steady, "have you ever made a movie?" Silence. Caldwell blinked. "Excuse me?" he asked, as if he'd misheard. "I asked," Clint repeated, his tone unchanging. "Have you ever made a movie?" The class stirred. A few students exchanged wide-eyed glances, sensing the shift in power. Caldwell opened his mouth, then closed it. He let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Well, I've studied film extensively," he said, "and I've analyzed—" "That's not what I asked," Clint interrupted, voice never rising. A few students stifled nervous chuckles. Caldwell's face flushed slightly, but he quickly regained composure. "Look," he said, forcing another laugh, "I don't have to be a director to recognize outdated themes." Clint nodded, leaning forward just a little. "That's funny," he said, voice slow and deliberate, "'cause I don't have to be a professor to recognize a man who talks a lot, but doesn't know a damn thing about making movies." The room erupted. Some students laughed openly. Others tried and failed to hide their amusement. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He'd lost control of the class. And the worst part? Clint wasn't even trying. Clint leaned back, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The classroom was dead silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "So," Clint said, voice low but commanding, "what do you think real storytelling is, Professor?"